Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Row-Level Security with Reveal. My name is Jason Beres. I'm the Senior VP of Developer Tools here at Infragistics. And if you're a customer or a prospect, we've spent time together. Thank you for joining. If you're just checking out Reveal, this will give you a good insight into how you can enable more secure data access in your application. So today's agenda, we'll look at securing data in Reveal. We're going to spend most of our time in a demo. I have like a simple demo, then we're just going to add a bunch of stuff, and I'll walk through some different techniques you can use to enable different types of data access to your users. Some housekeeping. Recording and slides will be available after the webinar. Please ask questions in the chat or the Q&A window. Make sure if you ask a question, you send it to everybody so everyone can see the question, and we'll answer it during the webinar. So let's go ahead and get started. So with Reveal, this is the biggest difference between Reveal and other systems like Power BI or Domo or Tableau or Sisense. Reveal is purely an SDK. You are 100% responsible for handling how your data is accessed. Reveal, because we're an SDK, doesn't know anything about your data, your users, your servers, etc. I get this question a lot where customers are like, well, how do I add my users? Well, you don't add your users. We don't know who your users are. We're not connecting into some back end that you're selecting users and doing some administration to enable data. Other systems do that, but those are completely different. Those are hosted servers where your data or your dashboards are up in their cloud, and you're always accessing their cloud, which is really where you lose control over your own experience. So no matter what, when you look at this SDK approach that Reveal has, it's very unique in the market. So the client library and the server library combine to give you complete control over all of your data access, and the entire experience that you give to your users. So really, Reveal only knows what you tell it. Data access works just like it does in your applications, and these are prospects that we move to customers that have the most success is that they already have a line of business app. They already have all this data access code. They're displaying data grids and charts and whatever else. They have security defined. Well, you're going to use all of that in Reveal, or you need to build it so Reveal can deliver data to your users to either view or edit or create dashboards. So when we think about different data providers, Reveal has about 30 different data providers, everything from SQL Server, Postgres, Google, AWS, Redshift, Athena, analysis services, you name it, Azure, of course, all the Azure stuff. But, based on the data provider, you have different capabilities and features. So for SQL Server, we have stored procedures. For Postgres, we have functions. And when you're working with data inside of Reveal, you can execute a stored procedure, you can execute a function, you can pass parameters. We're going to look at how you can do that today to ensure that only people that are supposed to see your data are actually seeing your data. So how does this work? There's many ways for you to handle security. Ultimately, on the Reveal server, you're doing a query to your data source. How you decide what data to query is completely up to you. Reveal does have some helpers that if you don't have any infrastructure set up, you could use. So on the client, we have something called set additional headers. Set additional headers allows you to pass information from the client to the server. And then in the server, we have something called the user context provider, which can pick that up. And then every single method that Reveal uses to access data, we check the user context to see if you have something in it and if we should use it in some way, maybe in a query, a parameter, etc. So here's an example of what the user context provider looks like on the client. You can see I have Reveal SDK settings, set additional headers provider, and then I am setting a header called xheader1, and then passing something called some variable. We're going to go into detail in the demo on this. And then in the server side, it gets picked up by the user context provider, get user context. In this case, I'm going to grab that header, and actually I have a misspelling here. I have xheader1, x some variable. It's really, I'm going to request xheader1, and then I'm going to use xheader1 as the user ID that I'm going to pass throughout my queries. And we'll see how this works a little bit later. So what you're going to see today, and when you're implementing Reveal in a POC or in production, is that every interaction with data, so when I open the data sources dialog and select a data source or a data source item, when I drag a value or a label or a data filter in the WYSIWYG designer, we're constantly going back to the server, and we're following a code path to ensure that you are allowed to see whatever you're trying to see based on what you're requesting from the client. So if there is no user context, if you're not doing any security, no problem. Everything's wide open. You're just going to get data back. If you do use user context and you are trying to implement security, you're going to see that we're hitting all of these functions on the server multiple times during that process. So when we attempt to access data, the first thing that we do is we check the user context. Then we go to the data source. What is the data source properties, and how do I connect to the data source with resolved credentials? If I'm using the object filter provider, how am I limiting or enabling data to display in the data source dialog that you can see on the client? So for example, on SQL Server, you've got tables, views, stored procedures. Do I want everyone to see everything? Or do I want, based on role, only certain people to see certain things? And then change data source item async is ultimately where queries are executed. So if you are a customer, you're like very familiar with the way all of this works in the flow of the server execution. If you're new, this is a very simple way that Reveal enables secure data access to your back end. So in my examples today, I'm sort of mocking this tokenized parameter-based searches. When you are passing data from the client to the server, the safest way is that you're using some sort of a token, and then you're parsing that token based on something on the server, and then you're looking up, user information or whatever. I'm not doing anything complicated like that today. I'm passing information back and forth in clear text, which is perfectly valid as well. It's valid in if I want to pass a variable to do a query to, view a dashboard, and it's not like super secret. Where you do want to ensure you're using a token or some secure communication between the client and the server is if it's your username, your password, things like that. Of course, you're using HTTPS and you're using cores, so you're only allowing certain things from the client to the server. But again, security is up to you. We give you APIs to interact with data. So in this case, I have a drop-down with all of my customers, and then when I go to create a dashboard, I'm only allowed to see that specific data. So we're going to create a few drop-downs today, and you're going to see how you can pick up whatever's passed from the client, use it in the server however you'd like. And then in the case of executing that specific query, I pulled in that username. I'm assigning it to the user ID in my user context, and then I'm using it here in my SQL DSI procedure parameters. So when you are executing a query through change data source item async on the server, you can execute a custom query, a stored procedure, or maybe a function if you're using Postgres, or stored procedures in Oracle, BigQuery, etc. And then those all have parameters. So how can you pass parameters to those collections or queries? So in this case, I have a customer ID parameter in my stored procedure. I'm passing the user ID to that. It'll execute on the server and only return back what you are allowed to see. Now, what is important is that all of your queries most likely have some sort of parameter, right? You're not just letting everything be wide open. So if you have 100 stored procedures, then you probably don't want to have like 100 listed in this change data source item async. You're going to want to figure out a scheme where you're querying the server for whatever objects that you want the user to be able to work with, and then you're dynamically creating this on the server. So there's a lot of techniques to do that. It's really up to you how you architect your application. But at the end of the day, unless all of your data is wide open, or you're doing multiple tenants, right? So I have physically separated tenants, and that's on the change data source. Async is where you would set up your tenant IDs, and then you would connect to those physical tenants. Then you could just have this wide open. So it's really up to you how this all works. So let's take a look at a demo and see how you can implement security in your Reveal app. We're going to start with an HTML page that I set up, which is essentially what you would be doing. All of this code will be available on GitHub, so you can grab it and copy exactly what I'm doing. The way that you get data from the client to the server, again, we give you the helpers, but it's up to you to ensure that it is on HTTPS, that it's tokenized, encrypted, whatever you're doing. But what I'm going to do here is I have a select of all of my customers, and I only want to allow each customer their own data. Like, they're not allowed to see any other data but their own data. So the way that you do that is on the server, you have where clauses or parameterized stored procedures based on whatever that user context is coming in. So in this case, I've got just faking a bunch of different customers that may or may not be logged in. So it's like impersonating these customers. To set up Reveal, of course, you need the Reveal JavaScript library. And if you are not familiar with Reveal, the way that the client and the server communicate is through a base URL. So you call set base URL on the Reveal SDK settings. In this case, I'm running at localhost 7006. I mentioned in the slides the set additional headers provider. This is how I am going to get header information from the client to the server. It's very simple. It's basically one line of code. Set additional headers. It's taking the URL, which was set inside of the set base URL, and then you are returning whatever headers you happen to have. In this case, I have a headers array. So how am I populating that headers array? Of course, it's being populated from whatever gets selected from my customer ID select. So let's take a look down here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start in edit mode. So I want to create a new dashboard or new visualization. And I am going to get the selected customer ID and pass that to a header called xHeader customer ID. So on the server, I will be looking for xHeader customer ID to retrieve whatever was selected here on the client. The way that we present data sources and data source items to users is through the Reveal Data Sources callback. And in this case, I have a single data source item called Orders by Customer. I am using an Azure SQL database. And on the client, you're not specifying any private information. There's no user ID, password, host. You don't have to include the stored procedure name or anything. All you need really is an identifier, which you can use on the server. So I'm using the ID property to tell the server what to do once this incoming request comes in. So in this case, I just want to show this data source item. If I wanted to show the data source, I would do a DS here. So I would show the data source. There's two arrays that you would use, but I am going to remove this and I'm just going to show this data source item. So let's right click and view this in the browser. So this is what start in edit mode looks like. And here is my drop down. And what's going to happen here is if I select a customer ID like blouse, and I click plus visualization, there's my orders by customer. So I'm going to select this. And this is the normal workflow of Reveal. I'm seeing all of the fields from this particular schema, whatever that happens to be, and I can do something with it. So let's go ahead and do a grid, and I'm going to grab the customer ID, and we see blouse. So, of course, I've asked for blouse. I get blouse back. Let's close this out. I'll discard. Let's change this to DRAC-D or whatever it is. Let's click plus visualization. We'll go through the same thing. We will grab the customer ID and maybe the order ID. And you can see DRAC-D is all I have. And let's not do a sum of orders. Let's do a count of distinct rows. And DRAC-D has a total of 6 orders. How is this going back and forth to the server to only give me what I'm requesting back? So let's go ahead and discard this and jump over to Visual Studio. And in Visual Studio, I have a .NET Core server app. You can do this with Java or Node. We support all of the servers. The code is more or less identical, but we have samples online of each one. I'm using .NET Core today. Here you can see that I'm using the Reveal SDK 1.6.4, and I'm using the SQL Server Provider 1.6.4. When you're using Microsoft SQL Server Provider, it works for both the SQL Server on-prem, cloud-based, and Azure SQL. So it doesn't matter. You can use SQL Server and Azure SQL interchangeably. But if you recall, the user context provider, get user context, is how we pick up the HTTP context coming in from the client. So what's happening is when we set additional headers and the request is made to the server, we are executing get user context. In this case, I want to say that the user ID, which happens to be a default property that we use just for simplicity. So you have a user ID, and then you can pass around a collection key value pairs of properties that might have additional information like company ID, user ID, role ID, however many you want. You could have as many as you want. But in this case, remember, we're looking for X header customer ID, because that is what we passed from the client. So every time we're executing a data request by dragging a field, trying to open up a table, etc., we go to get user context. Now, once it's in this user ID, this user context is passed everywhere in Reveal. So if I jump over to my data source provider, you'll see that one of the parameters of change data source item async is the user context. If I look at my object filter, one of the parameters is the user context. So what we're doing at every touch point is we're checking that user context, which is how you can ensure that no matter what requests are coming in, you're always checking to see if whoever's asking for it is valid. Now, when I set this up here, if I go to my user context provider, I'm pulling in my HTTP headers. But let's say in your application, you already have this information, or you're going to do another function call to determine what the security model is. You would do it here. You would set the user context because it just makes it easy whether you're using the HTTP context or you're setting properties and user ID yourself with your own information, because all of the Reveal functions use user context, which means, in this case, I'm executing the stored procedure. So the way that individual data source items are executed is through change data source item async. In this case, I'm saying, hey, if the data source item is a SQL Server data source item, remember I said Azure SQL Server, you can use interchangeably. Then let's go ahead and continue through this if statement. I am going to set the stored procedure that I want to execute to the name of the incoming ID from the client. So from the client, my incoming ID was called orders by customer. So that's actually the name of the stored procedure that I want to execute. So I'm just making it simple here, setting this property, and I'm done. And now I have my procedure parameters. So what's going to happen when I pass this over to SQL Server? Well, there's a customer ID parameter, and I want to give it the user context.user ID. So let's go ahead and set a breakpoint here. Let's set a breakpoint in the user context provider, and let's go ahead and rerun our client application. We're going to do the same thing. Open in the default browser. Let's go ahead and select Bone App as a new guy here. I'll say open up my data source dialog. Now, no call has been made to the server yet. Nothing has happened. This is completely client side. Now I'm going to click orders by customer, and then boom, the first thing that happens is it's trying to determine what is orders by customer. In this case, orders by customer was a SQL Server. If we hover over, you can see that I've got my order by customer is the SQL DSI.ID coming in. And in fact, if we go to user context provider, let's set our breakpoint to right here, not right there, because we're already past where we want to check what's coming in with our headers. So we'll just go ahead and hit continue. And now we're hitting this again because remember, each touch point is getting hit multiple times on the server. So as we select the resource from the client, it's checking that you have permission to see it. The next thing it's doing is it's going to say, hey, do you even have permission to see all of the fields that are available? So we're going to continue to hit this multiple times. So now if we go back to the client, we'll change this to a grid and we'll grab customer ID. Now, every interaction is getting checked on the server. You can see that the server is saying, hey, wait a second, can you get past my breakpoint? So again, let's take a look. Our user ID, user context was set to Bonap. We'll go and we'll step through this. We'll return that data source item. Here we are getting the user context, checking that user context again. I do a console.writeLine. Of course, my user ID is Bonap. It's set again. And I'm going to get rid of these breakpoints for a second here, and we'll just kind of let this guy run. I will grab customer ID, and here is all of the Bonap customer IDs. So the only thing that got through was the selected item. And you could see that there was a couple breakpoints that were stopping at these breakpoints, and we stepped through to see that that's all that was allowed to be retrieved from the SQL Server. So let's go ahead and close these out, and let's minimize this again, and we'll take a look at the server in a little bit more detail. In my change data source item async, this is really where all of your bespoke data source items execute. So for example, if you have 100 stored procedures, you could have 100 of these guys here, and they could have all different parameters. You could have custom queries. You could have whatever you want here. If you have a large amount of tables, stored procedures, etc., that you want to expose to your client, it's best that you're dynamically generating this from maybe a table. Like, so you have another table, which is, here's what this user is allowed to see. And then it's going to be very easy. You're not going to have a lot of code here. One of the challenges with Reveal is that because it is an SDK, it's just like your application. If you're adding a new screen to your app with a new data grid and you need a different query from your back end, you need to recompile your app. Well, you don't want to do that, right? So you want to have everything as dynamic as possible. You don't want to have to rebuild the Reveal server just because someone added another request for a query. So you have to figure out the best way to ensure that everything you're generating is dynamic, or you're pulling from a table, or you're just using the data source instead of the data source item. And we'll talk about that next. So the data source dialog is another way that you can present information to the user. So if you remember, I defined a data source here. Here I have my data source item. I want to display the data source to the user. So if I right click here and I open this in the browser and I click plus visualization, you can see now I have my full data source. And there's nothing on the server that's stopping me from doing anything unique here in terms of the data source. So what you'll see is that all of my tables, views, and stored procedures are available on the client. Now, if I go ahead and I select order analysis, and I'm going to do a preview, just click the preview data, I could not find stored procedure, DBO, blah, 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 order analysis. Why did it do that? Well, it did that because my assumption in change data source item async is that the name of the incoming ID is going to be the name of my stored procedure. So if I set a breakpoint here and we view this in the browser again, and I'm going to click this and I'm going to click this. Let's go to our views. We'll go to, well, actually, it doesn't matter. We'll go to any one of these. So what is the incoming request? And let's just set the breakpoint here, and I will hit run. What is my SQL DSI.ID? Well, it's from Northwind Cloud, and it's saying that it's employee order count. Well, I don't have a stored procedure called employee order count. This is a view. So I would have to say, well, if it's not a procedure, it's a view, whatever. So you need some technique to do that. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit of code here that I already have pre-baked. So I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to hit the Enter key a few times. I'm just going to hit paste, and I've pasted in a big block of code here. But let's go through this code and make some sense of it. So what I'm doing is adding some if-else statements. The goal is that I'm still using the incoming ID or the ID from my data source item. Remember, I was checking my SQL DSI.ID. If the SQL DSID equals whatever, I want to assign it to that being the stored procedure name. Well, in this case, I want to check what the prefix of my ID is. And if it's SP, it means, well, that's a stored procedure. We scroll down, and if it's CQ, that's going to be a custom query. If it's TB, I'm going to do something with a table, and we'll kind of get into that in a little bit. But if we scroll back up and we see that if the prefix is SP, then I want to check what this stored proc name is and then assign it the stored procedure name and then give it the parameter that it needs. So in this case, if I have orders by customers, I have a stored procedure parameter, and I want to pass the customer ID, my user context, that user ID. If it's order details, I want to pass the order ID to the incoming order ID that I picked up from my user context. So here I have an order ID. Where's order ID coming from? Well, I'm saying, hey, there's a property called order ID in my user context. So let's go ahead and use that. And then for employee ID, I want to do something very similar to the order ID. I am going to check the employee ID from my user context properties, and then I'm going to pass that as a variable to the employee ID in my orders by employee ID. Of course, we have not added any of these properties in our user context provider. So let's go ahead and do that. So in the user context provider, currently, we are only picking up X header customer ID. So I'm going to pick up some new headers, employee ID, order ID. What I'm going to do is I am going to paste in some new code here that is doing just that. So in this case, I'm going to request headers, X customer ID, X header order ID, X header employee ID. Now remember that the user ID is a default property in Reveal, so you don't have to set that in your props. The key value pairs in your props need to be set with other headers. So that's where we're going to pass props. And if I go back to the data source provider and we look at what this is looking at for its parameter, it's looking at the properties. So user context dot props, employee ID, and then I'm going to pass that here. So it's very simple, this mapping back and forth. So at the user context provider, this looks good. It's everything that I need. But in order to make this work, let's go ahead and modify the client. So in our index headers.html, there's a few changes we need to make. I want to add a couple more combo boxes here, or selects, HTML selects, that will display additional information. So I want to have some orders. Of course, we're going to pass this to the order ID in the header, and I want to have some employees. So there's going to be some different stored procedures that we want to use based on what we want to request from the database. So let's scroll down, and where we are picking up this selected customer ID. So this is going to be our customer ID header that gets passed. Let's get the other combo select. So I've got selected order ID, and that's going to be my header order ID, and this is going to be my header employee ID. And of course, if we go back, this is how we're picking them up on the server. And then again, this is how we're using them within the change data source item async. And then finally, we do have one stored procedure that we're using here, but we want to add a couple more. So I need data source items to match those additional ones that we added up on the server. And so I'm going to add a data source item 2 and a data source item 3. The way those are presented to the callback for the user to actually select them is by adding them here. So let's do DSI3 So I'm going to show my data sources. In fact, we can get rid of the data source. We don't need it. We'll just show these data source items. And if you remember, we're looking at this prefix SP. So SP is what's going to trigger looking at these as stored procedures. And then we're going to set the stored procedure name to the ID here. So let's go ahead, open this up in the default browser. You can see I have my additional items here. So let's go ahead and select the bottom one of each of these. So I'm going to select order ID 10255. We'll do Ann Dodsworth, and we'll do Ernst. So I'm going to do plus visualization. So for orders by customer, when I execute this, it should be only getting the Ernst orders. Let's go ahead and hit this guy. But remember, we did not restart our server after I stopped it. So let's hit run on our server, make sure that we're actually able to access data. And now let's see what we got for Ernst. So I'm going to go to my grid and we'll grab customer ID. And all we see is Ernst data for this specific request. If I discard this and we'll do orders by employee, we should only see orders by Ann Dodsworth. So let's go ahead and do employee last name, and we'll do order IDs by this employee, and we'll do count of distinct rows, and Ann Dodsworth had 43 total orders. So let's close this, and we'll finally select order details. So order details is going to look for 10255 as its order ID. So let's go ahead, grab the grid, do the order ID, and we should only see 10255. All of the HTTP context that we're setting on the client is getting picked up by the server, and we're effectively able to do a row level security. Now, what happens if I'm not using stored procedures? No problem. You can do custom queries. So if we scroll down, remember SP was our prefix here. I have another prefix called CQ. So for CQ, let's go ahead and add a custom query. I'm going to get the employee ID again, the same way I retrieved it for my stored procedure, and I'm going to use it as a parameter in a custom query. So here, I'm going to say select star from order analysis where employee ID equals employee ID. That simple. Let's go back down to the client. Let's copy this, and we'll add a fourth one, DSI4. And DSI4 is going to be our custom query. So we'll call it CQ, custom query, special details. And this title is not going to be order details. We'll just call it custom query, orders. And yes, now we need to add, comma, DSI4. So this shows up in the dialog. Let's right click, open up in the browser. Let's click plus visualization. So we'll select custom order queries, and just like that, our query executes. Let's go back to our grid. We'll grab employee last name, and we should only see Devolio. So there we go. All of Nancy's orders are coming through that custom query. So it doesn't really matter if you're doing stored procedures, if you're doing custom queries, or even if you're referencing a table. So you could just say if SQL DSI dot table equals whatever, then you could execute something custom there as well. But what happens if you don't want to do this and you just want to manage what a user sees based on the full data source? So if I go back to the client and I remove all of these, and let's say that you just want to make it simple. I'm going to right click, open this up in the browser, click plus visualization, and I want to see all the views, tables, stored procedures, etc. So there's another interface called the IRV object filter that you can use to control what shows up in this list. So let's go ahead and modify, or actually we'll just take a look at it. So I'm going to go here and we'll go to the object filter provider. And what I did here was I only want people of a certain role, which is the admin role, to see everything. Otherwise, if you are the user role, I only want you to see these three tables. So what we're doing is we are looking at what's available on the server and returning or not returning what is allowed. So in this case, I'm doing the not allowed items contains SQL item.table or SQL item.procedure. So it's going to make sure that the only things that get through are tables named customer orders and order details for the role called user. How are we going to set up this role called user? Well, if we go back to our user context provider, we need to create another role here or another property called role. So let's hit enter a couple times, and I'm going to go ahead and paste in this role called user. Now, if the user ID is a root or blonde P, they are going to be considered admins. So here, let's pass these properties along. So I'm going to say we have this role property, and what are we going to pass? We're just going to pass in role. And we need one more of these guys, and then we're good to go. So I've got order ID, employee ID, and role. Role is here, and it's going to be set as user. Unless you're a root or blonde P, you're going to be an admin. So let's do our hot reload, and we should be good to go. So if I go back here, and I right-click, I open this up in the browser, and let's just do Annotar, click plus visualization. There's the SQL Server data source. Now I can see everything. Why is that? Well, there's one other thing we need to change on the server. So the way that all of these interfaces, IRV user context provider, the IRV data source provider, the authentication provider, and in this case, the object filter are registered with this application are in the builder in program.cs. So here I'm doing an add controllers, add reveal, and then I'm adding all of the things that I want the server to be aware of and execute. I need to make sure that add object filter is part of the builder. So let's go ahead and do a hot reload. It says everything was applied successfully. We'll go back, open this up in the browser. Let's go back and do Annotar again. I'll do plus visualization, select this, and we should only see a couple things, and we're not seeing a couple things. So let's close this again. Let's go back here, and we will just start a new rebuild. I didn't believe that hot reload worked. It's like iffy for hot reload. You never really know. Even though it said there changes were applied successfully, this should do it for us. So let's grab our root. Or I forget, let's just do East C. East C should only be a few tables, and there we go. We only see the 3 tables that we're actually allowed to see. We're not allowed to see anything else. Now let's change this to blonde P and plus visualization, and now I can see everything because, of course, blonde P was an administrator. This is actually a really slick way to completely control all of the data access without worrying about what you're doing for each individual data source item. It works great. Now, if I go back and let's do Cent C plus visualization, I can only see 3 tables. We'll do a preview here, and you can see object not set to an instance, object reference not set to an instance of an object. Why is that? Let's go back to our server. Let's go to the data source provider, and I have this if statement. And I'm saying if it's an SP, else if else, return null. What this does is it says if you're not executing one of my bespoke data items, then I want you to return null. So then he can't access any data. Well, let's go ahead and comment that out. We'll do a hot reload, and we will rerun the client, right click, view in the browser, plus visualization, do this again. Let's go and preview customers, and you can see now I have access to customers, order details. I have access to all the order details, and if I want to do something fancy like do customers, click plus, fields from another data source, do this again. Let's grab all of the orders. Actually, no, I want to grab all of the orders, not the order details, so let me redo that real quick. Orders, select data. I want to marry my customer ID with my customer ID, and I want to grab the order ID, ship dates, things like I don't need customer ID twice, maybe freight, and ship country, join that data. So now I can do like, here's my customer ID, here's my freight, and let's do the average freight for every customer. And let's change this to a bar chart. So now I have average freight by customer. And if this is too much, let's drag this down to a data filter. And with the data filter, I can say top items, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to do top items. Just show me the top 10, and I'll create that filter. And here are the top 10 freight items. I can get rid of this, uncheck show legend, and there we go. And I'm off to creating a new dashboard with this visualization. And of course, I can duplicate this, go back into edit mode, and change whatever I would like. Maybe I want to do something fancy here. Let's do a map, and I'm going to grab world countries. And I'm not going to use customer ID. I am going to use the location of the ship country. So now I've got all of the average freight, and let's get rid of that data filter. And it's showing me freight by country, just like that. Super easy. Change the title, freight by country, and I'll check my box, and that's it. We'll call this webinar dashboard, hit enter, save, and now my dashboard is saved. So that's it. That's how easy it is to not only do a row level security with headers being passed, but also being able to completely control what shows up inside of the full data source dialog. So there's no stored procedures, no views, just tables. And with that, let's head back over to the slides. Okay, so that kind of wraps up. I know we went a little longer than we usually do, but I really wanted to get across how easy it was and all of the different options that you have. Of course, keep in mind, I'm doing things a certain way. We're giving you APIs. You have all kinds of capability to customize what I showed you in that demo. So while we wrap up, JJ or Jesse, thank you very much for popping up the poll. Please answer all of the poll questions. They are very important to what we do with Reveal. Everything that you suggest goes into the product eventually. So we are driven by happy customers. So we want you to use the product. We need your feedback to ensure that the features that we're driving in the product meet your needs. So please answer the poll and give us your insight. So to wrap up, if you haven't already, please download the Reveal SDK today and get a trial license. You can go to revealbi.io, download-SDK. Some of the resources that we have online, we have a really great YouTube channel with lots of videos there. But on GitHub, we've got tons of resources on GitHub. So if you want like samples on every aspect of Reveal, you want it in Java, .NET Core, Node, Angular, React, etc., please go check out SDK Samples JavaScript. It is a great resource for all things Reveal. And so, yes, we want you to get started with customizing your BI experience today with Reveal. So go to revealbi.io to set up a demo or a chat with sales. Go to sales@revealbi.io, or as usual, always feel free to email me, jasonb@infragistics.com, and we will set you up with a meeting to talk more about how we can help your organization in your digital transformation with embedded analytics. So as the poll wraps up, I will stay online for a few minutes to make sure that we are answering all of your questions. And I want to thank you for attending today. I know you have a lot of choices for your time, and we really appreciate you joining the webinar, and we will see you in a couple weeks at the next Reveal webinar. Thank you.
Hey.